Good morning. Good morning. Hey, good morning. I'm so excited that the coffee is a brewing. We are back in person. It feels oh man, so many smiling faces. I've never been excited to see so much teeth before. It's awesome to see everyone's face, and even masking, I totally understand. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We are live on YouTube. This is one of our first, so we are definitely excited to be able to live stream this. We have some people in the pool, but I want to go ahead and get started. I just didn't feel like standing today, so I'm just going to sit right here. So, welcome to the Spokane Homeless Coalition. My name is Robert Lippman. I am one of the leadership members, the chair of the coalition. Then we have co-chair Julie Garcia, Barry back there, and Rob. We all have our tasks assigned to us, a part of the coalition. But if you are interested in being in the leadership team, we are always looking for fresh ideas and perspectives. So please send an email to Barry Barfield if you are interested in leadership. But the coalition basically is an opportunity to provide education, advocacy, support, sharing of resources, and networking with each other. We do have a pretty large coalition Google Groups as well. And so if you are a part of that, I imagine you probably see daily emails all the time. But that is a platform to use and dispense information that your organization may want to make announcements, maybe even some collaboration with patients out in the field that you're working with, patient, client, however the reference you use. But it's a pretty large network, but again, it's also used for encouraging one another in our pursuit of that. And so one of my roles is I work for Providence Community Clinic, and we love to start meetings out with reflections. So our mission at Providence is to be expressions of God's healing love, witnessed through the ministry of Jesus, steadfast in serving all, especially those who are poor and vulnerable. So part of my reflection is, before working at this clinic, I spent some time working in hospice for a while, a good amount of years, people kind of approaching that end of life time period. And one commonality while working in this field was that families would always have this reaction to the circumstance of this feeling of helplessness. Right? You're watching your loved one go through this process, and you're helpless to what they're going through. There's not much you can do except be there with them. And so there's a lot of commonality between that and kind of the work we do as far as this feeling of helplessness, unable to control specific circumstances, but being advocates for those. And so for me, I like to reflect and take perspective from this guy mentioned in Providence's mission and try to put some application from this, a blueprint, if you will. And a part of that is this guy mentions, "Come to me all who are weary and burdened, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you." Now this is an interesting phrase, yoke. Now yoke back then was used in the farming context of this tool that would be strapped around an ox's neck, right? And they'd work in pairs. And so if you were a smart farmer, you would spend all this money on a blue ribbon ox, right? This strong ox. And they'd be paired with probably a more weaker, fragile ox. And so, but together, that yoke would combine the energy, and the weaker one could do the same amount of tasks that the strong one could. And keep in mind that each yoke is custom made. Did you guys know you're custom made? You're custom made to share the burden that the people that we work with are experiencing. And so I want to thank you for the time and energy and that sharing a burden and being yoked with the people that you serve on a daily basis. So thank you for listening to my reflections. I know they can go off on tangents sometimes, but thank you for taking time. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. jump in with this. We have some great aligned speakers up today, and so we're going to just go ahead and kick it off and start with Ben with a COC update from the Continuum of Care. I got an extra microphone for you, and today is a sitting day, so feel free to have a seat.
Thanks, Robert.
You're welcome.
How's everybody doing today? Woo! Come on, we're in person. This is great. We've been doing this for Zoom. I've only been here once in person. I appreciate your time. The Continuum of Care handles the HUD dollars. It's about $4.3 million. One update that we talked about last fall was the Youth Homeless Demonstration Program, which is called YHDP, that our community got. And that's $2.5 million over 2 years for youth homelessness. Now, that is in the process. We were awarded it last fall. Julius, you're here, has been working on that 2 or 3 times a week, coming up with the plan for how to spend that money over the next 2 years. The RFP for the youth programs to end youth homelessness will be coming out this month. The COC and the City of Spokane have partnered with Better Health Together. Melissa Morrison is heading up that project. That ties in directly with the work that Julius is doing on the ACI. And so expect the plan to come out to the community. It has just been approved and sent to HUD, and that'll be publicized over the next 2 weeks. And then there are discussions going on. One of the best things about the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program is that the Youth Advisory Board, which is made up of youth with lived experience, has informed every step of the process. And I think that's important when we're talking about homelessness, that people with lived experience are included in every single step from the very beginning of how you design and implement programs. The second one is that the shelter RFP that the city sent out, the COC just finished. We had 9 people from the Continuum of Care Board reviewing those RFPs. Those will go to the City Council with recommendations. Those will go to the full Continuum of Care Board and should be completed by the end of the month with an announcement. And then let's see, quick else is the federal government did award the annual renewal process that just came through. And Empire Health is leading the next stage of community planning. The next meeting will be April 13th. And just one other thing on the COC and homelessness is I just came back from a 4-day trip to Houston, Texas. And if anybody knows about Houston, from 2011 through the current time, starting in 2011, they had a new mayor, and she made it a point. HUD put them on the bad list, and that meant that they had about 9,000 homeless individuals. And now, 10 years later, in 2021, their PIT count, they were down to less than 4,000, and this year their PIT count is less than 3,500. So that's more than a 60% decrease in homelessness in Houston. Now, we went down and we interviewed 12 different people for a project to try to get this out to the community on how you actually decrease homelessness, and it was really, all 12 interviews were exactly the same. They said the community has to be on the exact same page, they have to have one plan, and there shouldn't be 8 different funding agencies funding homelessness. There should be one nonprofit with all of the pass-through dollars from the federal, the state, and the local that are making sure that plan is coordinated. And then secondly, they said they were going to use data-based interventions, so what actually drives decreasing homelessness. And what they found was it was housing, because people are homeless. And they built over the last 10 years 8,500 permanent supportive housing units, and they housed 25,000 people over the last 10 years. And that decreased homelessness by over 60%. But if I tell you they built 8,500 units of low-income housing, but they housed 25,000 people, what does that mean? That means somebody goes into low-income housing and they're not staying there for 10 years. They're actually staying there for 3 or 4 years, getting the supports they need, and then moving into market rate apartments. And so that's why when we think about housing in our community, we can't just think about Well, it's only low-income housing. Yes, we have to build thousands of units of low-income housing, but it's also about our housing market and having affordable apartments. They were able to move and house 25,000 people over the last 10 years. So that means 8,500 in low-income housing, and then move them out into market rate apartments, and then move more people from the streets into those 8,500 units because they free up as you move on. And that's the move on strategy. But that only happens, they had a 10% vacancy rate in apartments. What do we have in Spokane? Less than one, a 0.5%. I heard it got down last year to 0.3% vacancy rates. They're panicking down there now because their market is tightened up and they have a 5% vacancy rate. And that's panicking them because they were able to keep their apartments low for everybody in their community and have affordable housing because they had supply. And so when we think about housing, don't just think about it as, oh, we need more low-income housing. Yes, we do need more low-income housing, but we also need affordable housing. And that means that in a business district, you shouldn't have a house across the street. You should have apartments. Density should be around our business districts. We should have more supply of apartments. We should have mixed income neighborhoods. And so as you're talking out in the community or talking to your elected leaders, apartments that are affordable, not low income and indexed down, are just as important to our homelessness situation. I'll finish with a study that just came out, a book from 2 University of Washington professors. One was a sociologist that just said, one of the professors, and one was a data guy. Their book went and studied poverty in 30 different cities across the United States. And they said, we're looking at poverty rates and if that correlates to homelessness. And then they started looking at rental rates. And what they found is that cities with high poverty didn't correlate to how much homelessness was, but if rents were high in those cities like San Francisco and Seattle and Portland, even though their poverty rates were the same as some other similar sized cities back east, the homelessness was higher in the cities where you had high rental rates. And this dials in exactly the same as the Zillow study in 2018 that showed for every $100 increase in rent, you have a 5 to 6% increase in homelessness in a community. So housing in general is just as important as low-income housing. So keep that in mind when you're talking to your elected officials, because we have to get our housing market under control if we're going to solve this problem. So thank you, everybody, for that little diatribe, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Ben. Oh, nice. Thank you. My forehead was going to burn off. Thanks, Ben. It's always great to have that information. Up next, we have, let's see, Julius and Morgan. Come on up. You guys are our next presenters. How diversion relates to the coordinated entry. Hello, Julius.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you, everybody. Barry invited us here to talk about this presentation. This is a very truncated version of a presentation that we did for the COC retreat back in February, where we were just kind of providing some baseline and consistent information on like how coordinated entry system came to be, its general purpose, and then how that relates to diversion from a housing perspective specifically. One of the reason why we brought these specific program types or philosophies to the front of that conversation is just due to the fact that these are, when folks in our community identify that they're like wanting to take that step towards securing a permanent housing solution, these are the most available interventions and how they work together. So diversion as a philosophy certainly is being used by probably everyone in this room in one way, shape, or form, in that as we are meeting with folks, we're meeting them where they're at, we're finding out what their goals and what their needs currently are, and then doing whatever we can with whatever available resources that exist in the community, certainly, but also that those folks are bringing to the table themselves. The skills, the resources, and the inherent value that they bring to the table as well, and leveraging those to secure a permanent housing solution.
So is diversion based like case management support, or how does that work?
Yeah, so I mean, essentially, yes, it's like having that holistic conversation and providing whatever support that looks like. So case management is a huge part of that, or however you would define case management, as a concept. But yeah, that person-to-person support is certainly a huge part of what diversion is and how that plays into things. And I think that the way in which our community generally views and discusses the coordinated entry system, a little bit of that can get lost and muddied. And so the way in which diversion relates to that system specifically has a very specific context and relationship there.
And you may talk about this in future slides, but how does someone qualify for diversion, or what makes someone ineligible to receive diversion support?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think that leads to another point too, right? And I mentioned this, like the philosophy or concept of diversion and like how to implement that holistically. And then there are certainly diversion programs that exist in our community where there's certain funding sources that are available to be used for this, that, and the other thing, and those exist in many different ways. So I think that's another important distinction to make there, is that there's, how we engage in the diversion conversation and in the diversion process, and then there's the who's eligible for diversion funding. And I think certainly anyone and everyone should be benefiting from like a diversion first system, from a diversion first process, from implementing that community wide. And I will say that for most diversion funding sources, it's really anyone who's meeting any definition of homelessness, as broad as that can be. We try to open that up as much as possible. The idea being that it can serve folks who are actively experiencing like HUD-defined literal homelessness, as well as folks who are at risk of experiencing homelessness and providing that prevention piece.
And let's see, what's the time frame? Like, how long can someone be receiving these services?
So most diversion programs are looking at trying to resolve someone's housing instability or housing crisis within generally like a 30-day period. But again, like that philosophy and approach to discussing diversion and having a diversion conversation and meeting folks where they're at and providing a lot of those best practices that the majority of folks in this room are already applying, like having a person-centered approach, strength-based, a lot of those trauma-informed care, a lot of those general principles are, there's not really, certainly there's no time frame, but it's just like meeting folks where they're at as plans change, providing that opportunity to pivot and change with them to meet the needs as they're presenting in those moments.
And how do organizations get involved to offer diversion?
That's a really great question too. So, like I said, there are many different diversion programs that are functioning in our system and our community right now. Some of those are agency or even program specific. For example, Catholic Charities has a diversion program where folks who engage with staff from that agency are able to access that support. Right now, our community has 2 centralized diversion funds. So those are used, one of is being currently housed at SNAP for single adults, and one is housed at Volunteers of America for youth and young adults, so anyone between 12 through 24 years of age, unaccompanied young people. And so the idea with those is that while those dollars are held at a specific centralized location, anyone in the community who's serving folks whose housing is vulnerable or at risk or who are currently homeless can receive the training that's required in order to submit requests for that funding. So, for example, I know as the former fiscal administrator for the Youth and Young Adult Centralized Diversion Fund, there are folks from the school systems, folks from Catholic Charities, folks from smaller nonprofits, by and for organizations, a lot of these entities in the community that don't necessarily usually have funding specific for meeting folks' housing needs. They are able to then submit requests in to have those financial barriers removed from folks' housing goals.
Thanks. And then how does this all relate to the coordinated entry system? And can you kind of explain what the coordinated entry system for some people who may not be as familiar?
For sure. So I'm going to refer to a slide here. So coordinated entry is a system that was designed to address the issues. Historically, different programs would have different housing interventions, and they were all disparate. And so the coordinated entry system was designed to have one general stop and place where folks can go and receive an assessment in order to measure the rate at which they are vulnerable in our community, which certainly has its own implications, of course, and has done, as good and bad a job depending on like situations and whatnot, right? At any time we're prioritizing folks, someone's being left out. But the idea was that the folks in our community who are the most vulnerable are having access to those resources first, and that those waiting lists or waiting pools are all held in like a centralized location. Certainly, there are housing interventions in our community that exist outside of the coordinated entry system, but this is supposed to act as a central hub so that folks aren't having to run around town and go and get on this spot and that spot and then hear from 17 different people at once. It's to coordinate and create that a more effective and efficient use of that time and of those folks' their time and really drive that home. There are several different housing interventions that are available through coordinated entry, rapid rehousing being one, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, and then any continuous stay shelters typically go through the coordinated entry system as well. And so that system has been operating in our community for several years now, and has served a lot of folks in our community very well and has helped them meet their needs. And the resources available through that are not at a capacity to serve everyone who needs it, obviously. So diversion is a philosophy, but also a program that can be used to help mitigate some of that and serve folks in our community in a different way and add to the capacity of the coordinated entry system.
How does someone access the coordinated entry system or assessment? Are there specific organizations that provide that support? Is it good that everyone has an assessment? That's a lot of questions.
Yeah, so there are two coordinated entry systems that are operating our community right now. There's one for families, and that's managed by Catholic Charities, and the most expedient way to access that. So anyone who has dependent children in their care would receive would access support through the HFCA and diversion program at Catholic Charities, and SNAP operates the singles coordinated entry system, which functions on a more decentralized approach. So there are many people in the community who are also trained to conduct those assessments and enroll folks in that system. So while you certainly can go to SNAP, there are also other folks that folks may already be connected to in the community who can help get them connected to that coordinated entry system. I think one of the principles of like the diversion philosophy is that not everyone needs an assessment, right? And so I think sitting down and talking to folks and having that holistic conversation, finding out what their goals currently are and how our community is best set to serve them and meet that, that solution may exist outside of the resources available through the coordinated entry system. And so I think having that conversation first is really important, and will help create additional space for the coordinated entry system function so that it's not so restrictive to the folks who are only scoring the absolute highest on those vulnerability assessments, but that we are then able as a community to serve a broader range of folks who need that intervention, but who otherwise wouldn't be able to access it if their vulnerability score, their SPDAT score, as we use in our community, isn't necessarily high enough to meet that threshold.
So diversion, it sounds like diversion support can assist in like screening or triaging, preventing a bottleneck happening within the system. Now, what does that look like if the coordinated entry system does become too overwhelmed? Like do the assessments just stay in there, or do patients get transferred, or what happens at that point?
Yeah, so the way the assessments on the coordinated entry system function is that they are active for 90 days from the time in which they're conducted. So after 90 days, that enrollment and that assessment would expire, and folks, if they're still looking to access support through that coordinated entry system, would come back in and re-evaluate to make sure that, certainly as we all know, like the longer folks experience homelessness, the higher their risks for substance use, mental health, and some of those other vulnerability concerns, they can exacerbate certainly over time. And so the way in which that assessment is conducted is on a 90-day cycle. Yeah, so that's what it would look like.
And for those who aren't, maybe individuals in here are not part of the diversion itself program, but it sounds like it's like, go get a coordinated entry assessment that's going to determine what's going on. What is the best screening method to inform everyone in here before sending them to get a coordinated entry assessment? Like, are there certain things or certain documents that need to be in place before sending someone to get an assessment done?
So there aren't any documentations required to do the coordinated entry assessment. Certainly for certain housing interventions, certain documentation is required, although those things can be addressed while you're in the waiting pool and whatnot, right? Like while you're waiting for an intervention to come through. So those are certainly things that you can work on, but nothing's required in order to do the actual assessment. It's a very low barrier assessment, and the enrollment into coordinated entry doesn't require any specific documentation. Yes. Right.
So it sounds like the referral process outside of the coordinated entry system, which is kind of like the next step, requires those documents. So if those documents are unobtainable during those 90 days, then it's like there's a repetitive motion, I guess, that takes place. Is that fair to say?
Certainly, yes. So, I mean, if your goal is to have a lease signing, then certainly you're going to need identification to prove that kind of thing through the rental application process. Anything involving the housing authority, whether that's like a voucher, permanent supportive housing, those kinds of things, like additional documentation certainly required. But for the coordinated entry specific process, that's not a requirement.
Okay. So it would be fair to say for individuals to maybe screen, like understanding they go through the system, but kind of helping them determine what their ultimate goal is before sending them to have a coordinated entry assessment completed. And I saw a hand raised. Was there a question, Tammy?
So there have been studies done and evidence to show that an acuity that someone would score on like a vulnerability assessment doesn't have a direct correlation to whether or not someone will be successful in going a diversion route. And I think part of that too is that diversion also uses a broader definition of like a successful housing intervention as well. So while it certainly can be an independent housing where you're like living on your own and doing all the things. That can certainly be part of it, but diversion also looks at what could a short-term, temporary solution look like longer short-term, a few months as opposed to like a full year or two. What would it look like to have support from other community resources, meaning friends, family, if you're active in a church or other community organization, something like that, how can you double up or things like that? Certainly there are still barriers for a lot of individuals in our community for some of those routes that are might be recognized as experiencing chronic homelessness, but diversion does use a much broader definition of what a successful housing intervention can look like. Than what we look at when we're referring to a rapid program or transitional housing program or PSH and things like that too. So, yes.
Two more questions, and then I'll repeat the question so they can get the live YouTube feed. Tammy.
So with the 90-day expiration for, say, the assessment, is that also true with the referral? So does the referral also have to be refreshed in that 90-day window?
So does a referral have to be refreshed within the 90-day period of getting an assessment completed, is the question.
So I think it would depend on the referral, right? So, and also how the agency is conducting that. So like if someone is referred to transitional housing, it's going to depend on the transitional housing project as to how many attempts they're going to have and how much time they're going to be willing to allow to elapse before someone is connected to that, obviously, right? Like something like that. With a rapid rehousing referral, certainly you're not like, you don't get handed keys like you would with like PSH or transitional housing. And so it depends on like how much effort and energy and where folks are at in terms of like how long it's taking to secure that rental. And those are all agency specific. So I can't really speak to that necessarily, but it doesn't have, so I guess to answer that question, it doesn't have a very clear timeline in terms of after someone is referred into one of those housing interventions through coordinated entry.
Okay, and then my last one is just from my experience, I think it's imperative when you're going into a coordinated entry and you're having conversations that the social security card and ID are obtained before any referrals come in. So I know that you had mentioned that as well, because sometimes those take months and months and months. So in order to better provide services to our folks, we need to be working on those before an assessment hopefully is done, and then definitely before a referral is done. So I just wanted to get that out there as well.
So it sounds like not necessarily a question, but more of just like informing everyone, like it's imperative from an outreach worker's perspective that social security card and those important documents can be obtained prior to engaging with someone through that whole system process, so you're not replicating, duplicating that support. Anything else, Julius, or any other questions out there? Does anyone need any clarity on anything? All right.
So just one final thought, if anyone is interested in additional training on like the diversion conversation and how to access some of the diversion programs, as I mentioned, we currently have 2 centralized diversion funds that are operating in our community, one for single adults and one for youth and young adults. So if folks have an interest in gaining additional training on what that looks like, how to access some of those funding sources, I'll put my email here at the end. Please feel free to reach out to me or to Morgan. So I'm currently the Anchor Community Initiative Coordinator here in our community, and my colleague Morgan Smith is the Built for Zero Coordinator. We're both working in facilitating these cross-system community conversations to reduce and effectively end homelessness for the subpopulations that our initiatives are focusing on. So yeah, any additional questions, please feel free to reach out, and we are more than happy to make those connections.
Looks like we have a YouTube live question.
Just an announcement, Social Security is open for in-person
Social Security is open for in-person
today.
today. What about?
I'll send the email out about an hour.
Thanks, Barry. Man, Barry's just on those emails. Thank you, Julius, for taking the time to be with us. I definitely appreciate it. We all appreciate all the information. Okay, so next up, let's see, Kira Lewis. Is Kira still here from the public health sector of Spokane? Thank you for making it.
No problem.
Yes. Okay.
Morning, everyone. It's so nice to see people.
Okay, what are some updates from the Spokane Regional Health District? What's COVID doing? Are there variants? I'm sure we'll probably live the rest of our lives with a variant of some kind. But what's going on?
All right. And I decided to start with a really great update, and that is none of our shelters are in outbreak. I can't remember if that has happened since the start, since we started having cases in the shelters, but it's really good news for now. Kind of county-wide, we, for the last several weeks, had about 200 to 300 cases a week. So it's been really consistent. We're seeing that same kind of consistency in our wastewater because we expel COVID in our stool, and so we can measure wastewater, and it's an interesting way to kind of assess what's happening in the population, especially as maybe testing is going down. We're seeing really consistent amounts in our wastewater, so that's good news. As far as kind of how much BA2 we're seeing, it's becoming more and more the dominant strain in our cases. That's consistent here and statewide and nationally. And but we're not seeing an increase in hospitalizations. I can't remember how many we had this week, but I feel like it was 9 maybe. Oh, you know what? I shouldn't even say that because I don't remember. But pretty low. And no uptick in our hospitalizations over the last couple weeks.
Isolation, is there still opportunity if anything does happen for isolation support?
Yeah, so we still have 2 isolation facilities, one that's run by the Salvation Army, that's for adults and singles and couples, and one that's run by Family Promise for families. And we've had really low numbers of people who are needing isolation, primarily people who are testing positive and getting discharged from the hospital or from treatment facilities, so not a lot of action within our shelters. So I think we have 1 person in our TSA isolation facility right now, and it sounds like they're in the works of having that to continue through June 30th. And the Family Promise isolation facility has had really low utilization as well. I think 1 family here and there.
And how does someone make a referral?
All those referrals come through our epidemiology team, and how about I just share the phone number that's kind of the first phone number to call. I think I have it memorized, but I'm not going to give it to you off the top of my head because that's sketchy. But essentially, it comes through our team. Most of our referrals just come directly from shelter providers. We are doing testing in the shelters weekly. So we call it surveillance testing, and it's just weekly routine testing. You don't have to qualify based on having symptoms or exposure. We just test anybody there who wants a test, and it's a good way to kind of get a picture of what's happening in the shelters and catch people who may not be high risk for having COVID, like they have symptoms, but it's a good way to detect cases or outbreaks before they become significant. So we're continuing to do that. We have over-the-counter tests, which are a self-done test that we're giving to shelters to distribute to staff and patrons. So most of our referrals come from the shelters or through the hospital, but if you're doing outreach and come across somebody who has COVID, you can call this number and we can get them connected. And if for people who are doing outreach, if you guys are interested in having some over-the-counter COVID tests to distribute, call me and I can get some of those for you.
Thank you very much. And can you put your contact information through the Barry?
Yes,
Okay.
I will give my contact information and our homeless outreach coordinator, Chelsea. I'll give you her phone number, and she's the person to call for an isolation facility referral.
Thank you very much, Kira.
Yeah, can I just share one other little thing?
One other thing.
So since we're having a little bit of space to work on some other projects, we're getting going on some community collaboration, specifically around hepatitis C and syphilis, 2 communicable diseases that are disproportionately represented among people who are experiencing homelessness. And so we're really excited to work on some of those other non-COVID issues that people are facing.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So up next we have Jonathan Bingle. Jonathan Bingle is from the City Council, District 1. District 1. Thanks for being here, Jonathan. Thank you for your time. So
Thank you.
each of these past months, we've been kind of having actually like a unintended theme of city council members kind of coming and chatting about, their perspective of this mountain. Rob does a great job. We all climb this mountain of working with someone in homelessness together, and we all take a different approach up the mountain. I love that analogy. But okay, so Jonathan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, specifically what you do, maybe some background history of who you are, and just
Yeah. So first off, Kara, I want that level of energy in everything that I do. I was so excited as you were coming up. So a little bit about myself. I'm born and raised in Spokane. I went to Rogers. My family and I, we've been in ministry my entire life. My dad is actually in Johannesburg right now ministering. We've done missionary work my entire life. And so we've really been focused on helping those who needed the most help and were the most vulnerable around the world. And so that's kind of a little bit of my background. I'm pretty new to politics. I ran for mayor a couple of years ago, but ran for city council this time and won. And so that's sort of my extent in politics, is just the last couple of years of getting involved. So.
Yeah, and kind of what's kind of been your perspective regarding someone experiencing houselessness in our community? Have you been exposed to, working within any of the systems, or is it a fairly new concept for you? Or
So homelessness, again, in the United States is different than the homelessness we've helped around the world. And so in the few months that we've been in office, and one of the great things is that my legislative aide Nicolette Ochiltree has some great perspectives and experiences that I don't, and so it's nice to be able to work with her on these issues. But our perspective is, I realize that I'm the dumbest guy in the room when it comes to most issues, and so what I've tried to do is really just go and call every single person who's doing anything in the homelessness space and help me to understand what you're doing, help me to understand how important you are in the community and the work that you're doing and why it matters and how it's different than these other providers. And we've done everything from I did a tour with UGM. I've done ride-alongs with Julie Garcia. We've gone and checked out Salvation Army. I mean, we've just been all over the place, just trying to understand how it works, because in the Bible there's this really important concept of we're all members of one body, we're all working, and so even though we might be different portions of the body, if you are missing a piece of the body, you realize it and you know that something is missing. We all have a really important role to fill, and so that's kind of me just trying to understand who the players are in the game and what the work is that they're doing.
And how do you make those connection points once you've kind of obtained this information? Like, what then do you bring back to, I guess, your peers over at City Council when talking about this topic?
So we in our office, we have some pretty intense diagrams of, like, okay, so these people are fitting in here, these people are fitting in here, these people are fitting in here, and so then with all the information that we have, one of the things that we've learned, former council president Stucker talked about all these different organizations doing work as opposed to one cohesive unit doing it. And that's what we found, is that there are a lot of really good organizations that are doing really good work, but sometimes we find that we're, having some friction, not because people want to have friction with others, but it's just because we don't have a unified vision in what we're trying to do. And so what our office's focus has been on in this year is, how do we take all the different pieces, how do we take all the people who are doing really good work, put together a unified plan that everybody can get on board with, make it simple, make it plain, that everybody who reads it can get on board and say, yep, this is a great idea, let's go for it. And so our job, again, has been just compiling information and finding, okay, these people are going to do great here, they're going to do great here, and then how do we get all on the same page?
And how do you create that mentality or culture of a unified plan? What does that look like to you? Like, what does that mean?
I don't know how you can help others other than just demonstrating yourself, a willingness to listen, a willingness to learn, a humility and understanding what you know and what you don't know, what you're good at, what you're not good at, and realizing in the areas where you might have deficiencies, other people can be really strong, and not being afraid to share a burden with somebody else, not being insecure enough in yourself to say, I have to do this on my own. If somebody else gets credit, then I get diminished. Not being worried about, who's going to look good in this, but how can we just all realize that we're all very important in this situation and work together.
And you brought a folder with you. Well, I'm curious.
I
what's in
did,
the
yeah.
folder.
I have some numbers here. I wanted to give a little update because at the city council, we're not doing the hands-on work that many organizations are, but the things that we do is we have the ability to help fund the initiatives that are happening. And so I wanted to give an update on some funding that we've been given. So I gave this presentation to our CHHS board last night. So if you were there, you heard all this already. But so we have increased appropriations for the funding of mobile medical clinics in the region by $1.2 million. And this one we're excited about, I'm excited about because myself, Nicolette, and Chief Schaefer, Fire Chief Schaefer, we're going to be the ones helping to implement this and make sure that it's being done properly here in the city. We've increased the appropriation, $1.5 million for reimbursement of permit fees of attainable housing. So again, as former Council President Stuckert was talking about how important housing is, we realize how important housing is in the game, and so trying to find ways to make it easier for developers to develop in really good development for the city of Spokane. How do we help that? One of the ways that we can do it is reimbursing permit fees. We've appropriated $3.5 million for the support of homelessness service capital and operational costs. $3 million for.
What does that mean?
For service capital and operational costs?
Yeah.
This would be for us when we have partnerships with, Salvation Army or Jules Helping Hands, or we're giving money to them to, hire staff that they need to do one of the things. Because one of the issues that we ran into in the same way that everybody did is we found that some of our shelters weren't running at full capacity because they were having staffing issues the same as we were. And so funding for them to be able to be competitive in the labor market to have the required levels of staffing. That's sort of what that would be for. Or capital projects, if we need a building or something like that, then we can acquire buildings, or so that's what that specific one is for.
Okay.
Yep. And then, so $3 million was provided for culturally appropriate behavioral health services and interventions for at-risk and low-income youth. And then Mr. Stuckert talked about the YHDP program. HUD, he talked about the $4.3 million from HUD. And so that's kind of what we're doing at the city council level. So we've allocated, I think it's something around $12 million of our ARPA fund to this issue.
And so are there already predetermined organizations that these funds are dispersed to, or are they submitted through an RFP process, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so it's an RFP process, and so these funds we've basically just put in a bucket and said we're willing to commit $3.5 million to this, and then organizations will submit those RFPs, and we'll determine which ones we want to support after that, and then fund them.
Okay.
Yep.
Nice. And then let's see. Anything? Any closing statements, or just.
I think what I've learned so far from everything that I've learned from the community is there's really three things that we need in the city of Spokane right now. Is we need more shelter space to be available immediately. We need 24-hour shelter space. We need increased funding for behavioral or for mental illness and addiction treatments, and we need to be able to regulate our public spaces. Those are the three big things that I've learned over the course of my time so far. And it's only been a few months. I would love to keep in contact with everybody because we're learning at a pretty rapid rate, and I'm excited for many organizations. As you're campaigning, as you're doing things, you have certain preconceived notions about people. The things that I've been really encouraged by is, every organization has good reputation and bad reputation, and sometimes well-earned, good and bad. But the things that I found is that people's why across the city are pretty universal. The what that we want is pretty universal. It's generally in the how that we're finding some disagreement. And so I have found, and this has been encouraging for me, is that as I've dealt with many organizations, is that there is a lot of similar vision in the city of Spokane. There are small but big differences in the way that people do the how. But other than that, I've been really encouraged by the amount of compassion and empathy and people wanting to help people, and wanting them to be reestablished in the community. It's been really encouraging for me. So.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much, Mr. Bingle, for taking the
Yep.
time to visit with us. You're always welcome back. We always enjoy updates from City Council. If that's a routine thing. I know the coalition members would definitely enjoy that. Is there? Oh, question. You got my blind spot.
Hi there. Mm-hmm.
The question is, who reviews the RFP process when they're submitted for those specific funds that Mr. Bingle just announced?
Yes.
Yeah.
Who reviews the RFPs? And Nicolette might be able to help out here a little bit. So.
Yeah, so with the ARPA funds, City Council has a specific group that is, designating other subsets of individuals to go through that RFP process. So like you said, with the one of the mobile home clinics, it'll be Councilman Beagle, myself, and Brian Schaefer, the fire chief, that will be doing that RFP process, helping develop the RFP and helping to review that. But for other subsets of money, there are other groups. Sometimes it's Brian Flashy and if he's the president or something. That's specific to the ARPA funds. If it's something else independent of that, you might have someone like the CHHS board RFP subcommittee going through those proposals. But
And can you summarize basically what she just said for our
Yeah.
YouTube watchers?
Yeah, so depending on where the money is coming from depends on really who's reviewing the RFP. Sometimes it's a small committee, sometimes it's an individual, and so it just depends on where the money is coming from and where it's going to. And so I wish there was a more consistent process on that, but it's not. It really is dependent on where the money is coming from and where it's going.
And where do you submit the RFPs? Like, who do you submit them to?
Yeah, so the city puts out, a statement on the RFP process, and then I think you submit it to the city. I apologize again. I'm still learning this. Portal online, right?
Perfect. And are those RFPs announced as far as when they're posted? Like, how do organizations or community members keep an eye out basically for that?
So they are announced.
yes,
Yeah,
typically announced through a press release, but they're always, a whole list of them is always available
on the city's website. Yep. Yep.
List available on website. Barry's going to email that out for those watching on YouTube. Well, thank you
Yes.
so much again
Absolutely.
for taking time.
Sorry,
There's,
you
one more question. Who makes the final
Who makes
decision?
the final decision? I believe in the end we ultimately make the final decision based on whatever the recommendations are that come to us, because we're the ones that are controlling the purse strings, so we're the ones who are allocating the final dollars there. Yep.
Great.
Sweet. And we have a bunch of cards. I would love to stay in touch with everybody if you want to understand where we're doing, what we're doing. But I think there's some really exciting announcements that could be coming soon. I just want to thank the mayor's office. I know that they're working incredibly hard on getting some things done. Mr. Eric Finch over here, the unsung hero in many ways. Mr. Eric Finch is doing some great work, and so I think and not just the mayor, but I want to thank everybody in here, because I really appreciate all the effort, all the heart, all the blood, sweat, and tears that everybody's putting into it, because it's more than I imagined as I was coming in. So thank you to everybody here.
Yes, thank you. And speaking of Eric, he is up next. Thank you, Jonathan, for your time again. And thank you, Eric. Thank you for taking the time for being with us. It should be on.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, so just wanted to kind of get a brief update on the CHHS and how things are progressing and any updates that you're able to provide us.
Sure, thanks. And I think most has been said, because I think Councilmember Bingle, as well as Ben Stuckert, gave out a lot of the updates that we have, that the ongoing work for CHHS. This is now, I think, Jen Saracides, third month. So she's really, as the CHHS director, I think, coming along. I mean, she's got a great passion for this work as well. And I know she's coming to one of the future sessions, I think, for that full in-person introduction, and it is great to be able to be here in person. So I think in other priorities, I'll start, I think, with some of the funding things, and then we'll talk also about the emergency shelter piece, because I think there's a couple of important topics, and I'll try to cover them as quickly as I can. We are looking again, and currently in that RFP selection mode for a new large-scale shelter. Now, I think one of the challenges for this is that we all know, and we've all talked, and certainly we have been, trying to listen very hard. We all know that I think several distributed places is better than one larger space. I can't say that since working this problem since November, it's very near 100 different locations that I've looked at. We've really only come down to one that has been willing to entertain the use, and that's the one that we are honestly within days or hours of being able to finalize the lease on, and that is the only reason why we haven't been able to release the specific address yet. But we have started an engagement with council members and with neighborhood members and businesses so we can basically try to do this right in terms of the communication part. As was mentioned, the RFP review is in process. I can say at least that there were 3 applicants or 3 proposals that were given. I think since it is a topical question, since it's a regional shelter, goes to the COC RFP and evaluation committee to review, and they do that work, and then they make their recommendation to the full COC board. The COC board would then either kind of like approve that recommendation as they see fit, and then it would come to the council as a recommendation.
So the COC is acting as kind of like the consultant piece to the selection process?
Well, and I would even suggest that it's more. I mean, I think what we all want is we want a community-based solution. And as much as, and I know sometimes, we do need to listen and we need to respond as your city, but I can tell you there's an awful lot of passionate people at the city that are trying very hard to work on this problem every single day. But we also know that we have our limits, and city government by its nature is not necessarily, we don't have behavioral health. We don't have some of the other tools in the toolbox that we know are all needed for this overall set of issues. So the COC was really imagined to be the regional kind of consortium and that kind of advisory piece to help make these community-based, I think, recommendations and solutions. Where it does have a very direct role in terms of the HUD, the HUD NOFO dollars that happen every year. We are trying to use them as I think that I guess central agency, if you want to call it that helps inform on the regional solutions. And so that is why they are taking on that in terms of doing this RFP and evaluation subcommittee. So I can say that, like, from a staff piece, we're there to help and manage and get paperwork and get information, to the COC. We potentially would give a perspective in terms of, some of the operational needs that might go along with, but we are not part of the decision-making process for that recommendation. That will be that community group, as we've talked about. I think that's just an important thing to call out. So, we hope to get there, I think, in terms of the recommendation, over this next week or so, and then it will be up, to the COC board in terms of when they can meet in terms of approving that recommendation. We are trying to get that facility ready, and again, what we do expect is to be able to, by next week, be able to release the address and the location as we kind of complete, the kind of the real estate part of it, which is there's just some legal requirements there in terms of release of the actual address. So. But it's like a 30,000 square foot, kind of warehouse type facility with a couple thousand square feet of office space. The office space is meant to have, I think, a connection point and service providers, as well as, I think, consistent case management, kind of like on that 5 day a week, kind of 40 hours a week, type model. One of the things we've seen, and learned from, I think, all of you, is that if there isn't kind of a consistent approach to how we kind of, touch people and make connections, then it is just spottier. So we want to be able to have, I think, more of that wraparound service support kind of embedded within the model. We're also looking at trying to look at some of these things, and we talked about documentation and applications for IDs and those type of things, so that there's some of that kind of capability there, at least as a starting point, you know, where there's a couple computers and other things, and again, some of this navigation help. And then ultimately becomes a bridge if we need to move them to, you know, whether it be, you know, the resource center or another agency to kind of complete that effort. But we are trying to see it as a kind of a better connection point. We're also looking at that, and a lot of this will depend on the shelter provider selection, because we are mindful about the fact that each provider has a different way, right, that they engage, you know, with you know, the populations. But we do want it to, we do want to have elements of separation so we can mitigate the large space issue. You know, we have looked, I think, at a good 7 different models that are out there, you know, that have larger, you know, shelters, just so we can be mindful of what other, you know, organizations or municipalities have gone through. And so we look forward to kind of learning and adjusting and having dialogue about how we can increase separation in the spaces, and also build some level of a progression-based model within it. You know, so as we look at the space, there's also, you know, I think some big outdoor parking space, and we're looking at maybe pallet structures or other things that can be part of that mix, because I think that if we can allow people to come in, be assessed, and then help progress through, you know, and get kind of better level of service and a better level of experience, that might help them on their journey.
Yeah, and last question, I'll be respectful of everyone's time. But as far as is that expectation of how this specific location, it sounds like it's, you know, just been a nightmare trying to find a specific location, you know, as far as neighborhoods and everything like that goes. But as far as this, like, I guess, evolution or progression of that specific location to be something other than, you know, just a centralized warehouse, is that an expectation that the city has on whoever comes in to operate it? Or is that up to the operator to choose whether or not they want to kind of use that space how they see fit?
Well, it certainly has to be a partnership, but I think the intent for us is to make sure we're listening very, very carefully to what the provider, that selected provider, has, because we do understand that they're the ones, A, that are going to be running it, B, that have the experience and expertise in running it. So, you know, I think we're all, and it was, I think, a good comment by the council member. In many cases, we have similarities. There's more similarities that we have in terms of the outcomes and those type of things. It is the how. And so I do believe that we need to have some honest and frank conversations as we go through that how with the selected provider. But we're very open to, you know, to looking at the model that's going to work. You know, it's very hard, because I think until that provider is selected, it's hard to know because they all are different, right? And they'll have different approaches, and that's okay. We just want to find the one that works. There's one thing I wanted to close with, and I'm sorry, but I think this is the other important part of, as we look at the shelter, I know one of the other, you know, conversation points is this has been a challenge for, I think, the existing shelter providers. There's been a lot of fears/concern and challenges. Okay, well, what does that mean for the rest of the shelter system? And is there going to be, you know, whether it be closures, whether there's going to be a reduction in funding, you know, or other things? And I can tell you that is not the intent. We need more. I mean, I think there's been a frank conversation, obviously, over this past 6 months in terms of the overall capacity need, and the desire for this is to simply remove that capacity question, right, or that debate from the problem set. Now, immediately, in my view, that's just going to allow 2 of the root cause things to surface, which is behavioral health, you know, the integrated medical care piece, and substance abuse, right? But those are at least root cause. I mean, I think we all know that just providing a shelter doesn't necessarily fix the underlying, you know, challenges that an individual has. But I think we're excited to be able to kind of maybe remove the capacity debate from being center stage, because I think in some ways the more we can focus on the root cause, then the better we'll be. And the reason I bring up this thing for the other shelters is because I want them to understand that they're going to be supported, and the overall budget commitment that we have between the administration and the council is really in the $7.5 million, you know, range for these shelters to continue over this next year, and we'll have a lot to learn. This is going to be the first larger scale shelter at this size that we've done. So I think it would be wrong to think we're not going to learn and adjust as we go through the process.
Oh, question back there, yes.
I'm just curious, when we're talking about capacity and shelter spaces, when do we get the results from the point in time count?
Okay.
Results from the point in time count is a specific question. I don't know.
Yep. so we're working on that right now. And again, there was a lot of volunteer work and a lot of effort. And so I'll do this because I know people get very tired of waiting. The raw count number was in the low 800 range. Now that was before. I mean, there was a lot of teams that went out, and that's the unsheltered. That's in addition to those that are in an existing shelter count piece. And that's a countywide piece. That's about a 15% increase over what we saw when we did the last one in 2020, and less than I thought it was going to be, and obviously some others thought it would be. So part of this really is trying to go through and deduplicate, right? Encounters, because we had a lot of different teams covering ground. And then the other part is trying to make sure that we listen to the input that we had, because there was a lot of different teams, a lot of all of you that helped and helped contribute that information. So we're still going through that data quality piece that's really important to make sure we have, I think, a qualitative number. By the way, because this is another important point, all this information is feeding to the same type of planning process that several of the other speakers have talked about, where Empire Health has contributed or donated the facilitation to help continue that planning effort. Because what we're after is trying to get better gap analysis information, right? So we know the difference between what we have versus what we think in the community we need. And then to prioritize those gaps, right, so that we can bring this back for better funding solutions.
So maybe early May?
Yes.
Maybe early May.
Yeah, within 30 days. Yeah. Within 30 days.
Thank you so much, Eric. And if you have any questions, I imagine you'll be around. Thank you. And then, so lastly, that kind of concludes our... I didn't forget anything, did I? No, okay. That concludes our time with the coalition. Thank you so much. I want to leave some time at the end. So I know everyone wants to be chatty Cathy's. Is that still? Yes. So we are going into the announcement phase, Barry. Yes. And I will give Barry the mic for announcements.
If you have an announcement that you want to make, please come up here. I'll give you the microphone. We have about 40 people on live stream, so it's in addition to us. Here is the Regional Health District's information for phone numbers to get kits and testing. I want to say that I am the chair of the Community Housing and Human Services Board, the department that Eric runs. And that board has openings. I would love for you folks to apply. I sent it out on the listserv. Also, that department needs employees. They have been decimated over the last couple of years. They need employees. They need good employees like you. So please consider that. Bob, you got an announcement? Come on up so they can see on the camera.
Hello, I'm Bob. I work with SNAP. And I need to ask a favor. We have a crap load of money for IDs, birth certificates, and we need to spend this money. The contact person for that is Amy at 456 SNAP, and her extension is 3210. That money is flexible, so we can do birth certificates, we can do anything they need to get people's IDs and stuff going on. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Sherry? Or Robert?
Yes. One last thing. This is Jerry Ann wanted me to leave this for the Transitional Housing Way Out Center. Frequently asked questions, probably how to make a referral, what does the program look like. I'll leave these up front.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sherry Gudgetano. I'm with Spokane Valley Community Advocates. We provide resource navigation. We are partnered with SNAP to complete the county rent assistance applications and submit them to the SNAP portal. And then we have a rapid response network for urgent needs. And I've got flyers, and we just got our 501c3 approval letter in February, so we're super excited about joining all you guys as nonprofits.
Thank you. Are we done with announcements? Thank you all for coming. As soon as the PIT count is put out, it'll go out over the coalition listserv. So we will get that information out.